Among those who are relatively powerless in society, we certainly must count children. We all know in our neighborhoods children who as infants were vulnerable to delayed development and disease. That was a big challenge 100 years ago when the infant mortality rate was so high. We all are aware of how little children in our society become victims of neglect and abuse. Yes, children are at the mercy of those who care for them, and that's why many of them receive mercy and care, and that's also why many of our children do not receive mercy and care. We don't do very well in our society in caring for our children, and we need to improve. And yet here is this ironic relationship this morning in John 1:12 between the arrival of the Christ child and our becoming children of God. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. John, the gospel writer, means to tell me that power and children belong in the same breath. What makes this even more odd is that the one who gives the children power to belong came to earth as a child without power as we know it. Yes, that is what John the Gospel writer tells us. Through the Word made flesh, as a child, we are given power to become children of God. Sometimes being like children isn't all that bad. Especially when you're having a bad day. Somebody said recently, everybody wants their mother. When we need help with something, it can be a great relief to turn it over to someone who knows what to do. When we are lost, there's nothing better than finding someone who can show us the way. And if being dependent on another in the mundane details of this life has its benefits, how much better it is to be dependent on God in our faith lives. How much better it is to realize that the Lord and Savior, who was in the beginning with God, is actually God coming down to us, caring for us, embracing us, pitching his tent in our camp, feeding us with his own body and blood, and speaking loudly and clearly to every single one of us, you are born of God, you've got the power to become my child, now, here, and forever. So, Christ comes as a child to give us power to become children of God. But what does that mean? Paul's words in Ephesians give us snippets of what it means to have the power to become children of God. First, through the Word made flesh, God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing. At the heart of that blessing is the knowledge that we are cherished because God has had his eye on us since the foundation of the world. Second, through the Word made flesh, God has chosen to adopt us. And third, through the Word made flesh, God has bestowed unconditional grace upon us. And fourth, as we read in Ephesians, through the Word made flesh, God has cracked our captivity to sin and forgiven us. What does it mean to have the power to become children of God? We are children of blessing, we are children of adoption, we are children of grace, and we are children of forgiveness. Brothers and sisters, in and through the Christ child, power and children meet in the way God intends for power and children to meet. Just as children in their powerlessness receive strength, care, and loving attention from their parents, so do we, as those who belong to God the Father, receive grace upon grace. Those who receive Christ and believe in His name, He gives power to become children of God. The great preacher, Fred Craddock, and his wife, Nettie, once traveled to a favorite vacation spot in the Great Smoky Mountains. Here's how Craddock describes this visit. We were at dinner in a restaurant out from Gatlinburg. We were in a rather new restaurant called the Black Bear Inn. It was very attractive and had an excellent view of the Smoky Mountains. Early in the meal, an elderly man approached our table and said, "Good evening." I said, "Good evening." He said, "Are you on vacation?" I said, "Yes," but under my breath I was saying, "It's really none of your business." "Where are you from?" he asked. "We're from Oklahoma." "What do you do in Oklahoma?" Under my breath, but almost audible, I was saying, "Leave us alone. We're on vacation and we don't know who you are." I said, "I am a Christian minister." He said, "What church?" I said, "The Christian church." He paused a moment and said, "I owe a great deal to a minister of the Christian church," and he pulled out a chair and he sat down next to us. I said, "Yes, have a seat." I tried to make it seem like I sincerely meant it, but I didn't. "Who is this person?" He said, "I grew up in these mountains. My mother was not married, and the whole community knew it. I was what was called an illegitimate child. In those days, that was a shame, and I was ashamed. The reproach that fell on her, of course, fell on me in the community. When I went into town with her, I could see people staring at me, making guesses as to who was my father. At school, the children said ugly things to me, and so I stayed to myself during recess, and I ate my lunch alone. In my early teens, I began to attend a little church back in the mountains called Laurel Springs Christian Church. It had a minister who was both attractive and frightening. He had a chiseled face and a heavy beard and a deep voice. I went to hear him preach. I don't know exactly why, but it did something for me. However, I was afraid that I was not welcome, since I was, as they put it, a bastard. So I would go just in time for the sermon, and when it was over, I would scoot out because I was afraid that someone would say, "What's a boy like you doing in our church?" One Sunday, some people queued up in the aisle before I could get out, and I was stopped. I was trapped. Before I could make my way through the group, I felt a hand on my shoulder, a heavy hand. It was that minister. I cut my eyes around and caught a glimpse of his beard and his chin, and I knew who it was, and I trembled in fear. He turned his face around so he could see mine and seemed to be staring for a little while. I knew what he was doing. He was going to make a guess as to who was my father. A moment later, he said, well, boy, you're a child of, and he paused right there. And I knew it was coming. I knew I would have my feelings hurt. I knew I would not go back again. He said, boy, you're a child of God. I see the resemblance, boy. I left the building that day a different person. In fact, that was the beginning of my life. John writes, but to all who received Christ, who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God.